message today is the second in our Journey Through the Bible series. This one is called Weirdly Beautiful. It's based on Genesis 15, especially verses 7 to 17. See, one of the things I'm already seeing in this series, and we're all the way to week 2, mind you, is that it's tough to choose which passage. And I know that if I pick one passage from a week's worth of readings, there are some good passages that I will miss. Well, have no fear, I'm making a list for future reference, but I really wanted to try to have it that we are on the same journey together. So you might wonder, how am I picking the passages? Well, first of all, it's prayer. But secondly, I look for things that give me questions. Because I figure if I have questions, you might have questions too. And today I have 2 head scratchers for you. These are 2 things that I've read a lot of times. And one of them never made sense to me personally as a man. And the other I just sort of read and moved on because it was baffling and weird to me. Now, one of the things I love about reading through the Bible, the whole Bible, is you see the whole thing come together. You see God's pattern of faithfulness across time and across generations. You see how one thing leads to another, and you see God's hand on all of it. Reading the whole Bible may give you some questions, but it will also give you a lot of reasons to believe. And one of my favorite examples of this is Abraham. Now, I become concerned sometimes that I talk about Abraham too much in these sermons, and I know that he does work his way into a lot of sermons, but that covenant that he made with humanity through Abraham is just so powerful. In some ways, I think it's key to understanding all of Scripture. A childless older man is promised a mighty nation would come from his descendants. God promises him also that his descendants will bless all nations. And we see that wonderfully fulfilled nearly 2,000 years later in Jesus. Abraham's life and story can really confirm our faith. Of course, you'll also see some things in Abraham's story that will make you, as I said before, scratch your head. And some of that came up in our reading this week. Like Genesis 12. We see one of the most baffling things, at least to me, ever. As a man, I have a very hard time understanding this. It occurs right after Abraham first received his amazing promise from God. Abraham was 75, his wife Sarah was 65, when God made this amazing promise. And it wasn't long after that that famine hit the land. First of all, don't miss that. Just because God has a plan and a purpose for your life doesn't mean everything will always be easy. God made Abraham an awesome promise, and almost immediately after that, famine hit. Neither one cancels the other thing out. So Abraham and Sarah headed to Egypt to wait out the famine. But there was a problem. And this gives me so many questions. And we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but we have to look at it. Genesis 12:11. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." That gives me some questions. Does it give you questions too? Now, one of the dangers of reading passages like this is we want to assign our modern day values to it, and you can't do that. But still, this feels really wrong. I mean, first of all, I'm trying to imagine a world where my wife Dawn would take this deal, and I can't. For that matter, I pray I would never put her in that position. But there's another issue that I can't quite wrap my head around. When I share about God's promise to Abraham, I get to the part about their ages, and I usually ask how many of the 65-year-old women and the 75-year-old men would want to start off with a baby. And it usually gets me a little laugh, and we move on. But with this story of Abraham and his wife Sarah, I feel like I have to handle it a little more delicately. But I have to ask the question, how beautiful was this woman? If at age 65, the king would think to kill her 75-year-old husband just to have her. Am I the only one who struggled with that? And for the record, it doesn't just go one way. I can't picture a queen going after my wife so she can get her hands on all this, right? No. And I did a bit of studying. And I didn't really find anyone who took issue with this, or at least anyone willing to go there. Now, please hear me. I'm not saying she wasn't beautiful. I am fully aware that women can age like fine wines. And I'm also painfully aware that I am aging like milk. But then a couple parts of the story hit me. First of all, people lived longer in those days. Abraham lived to be 175 years old. At 75, he had lived just over a third of his life. Sarah lived to be 127. So she was only a little over half of her life. And again, I'm sure she was very beautiful because the Bible tells me so. And because in chapter 20, which is probably at least 20 years in the future from this date, Abraham did it again with his now 85 to 90-year-old wife. And my issue with this story is much more about Abraham than it is about Sarah. Because I know I can get fearful, I can. But his wife gets carted off to be part of the king's harem. And I can't imagine a world where I would be okay with that. And I pray I would never do anything like that to my wife, and I know she wouldn't put up with it if I tried. But maybe there's more to it than just Sarah's beauty. Consider right after this, right after chapter 12 comes chapter 13. I know we're doing advanced math today. Where we see Abraham and Lot having to part ways. And they had to part ways because they had so much wealth. So this means Abraham entered Egypt with a fortune in sheep and cattle, right? If the king took Sarah and killed Abraham, wouldn't all that wealth revert to the king too? Maybe this was as much about greed as it was about lust. We don't know. What we do know is the king was so taken with Sarah that he gave Abraham a whole pile of more animals for her sake. So instead of dying and losing his wife, the king made Abraham even more wealthy because of his wife. And remember, the king thought she was his brother. She was his sister, not his wife, right? Am I right about all this? I'm not sure. But again, the same thing happened in a whole different place when Sarah told Abimelech Abraham was her brother in chapter 20. So I don't understand everything in this story. But what I do know is God made a promise. He would bless whoever blessed Abraham and curse whoever cursed him. And when Abraham's wife was taken by the king, taken by Pharaoh, even under deceptive circumstances where Abraham failed to trust God for his protection, which is another issue I have with his actions here, even considering all of that, God still stood by his covenant. And think about what happened because Pharaoh took Sarah, because it sounds familiar. God sent plagues against Egypt until Pharaoh returned Sarah to Abraham, along with all of Abraham's possessions, including the extra stuff that Pharaoh gave Abraham because of Sarah. And it strikes me, that's the same thing that happened when Abraham's descendants ended up in Egypt 500 years or so in the future. The people were more or less kicked out of the society, carrying the wealth of the nation with them when they went. Folks, far be it from me to be too critical of Abraham. But God had just made him the promise about his offspring becoming a mighty nation. And he and his wife were old, and Sarah had been unable to conceive. Yet Abraham was willing to believe God could do it, and that was credited to him as righteousness, we'll read in today's text. But at the first sign of risk, he put his wife Sarah at greater risk to save his own skin. Where did all his faith go? Of course, when I ask that question, it forces me to ask a hard question. Where does mine go? Because I can struggle for far lesser reasons. How about you? The thing is, even when Abraham did something that to me shows a lack of trust in God and not a lot of regard for his wife's safety, God was still faithful and kept his promises, right? But then the Bible does say when we're faithless, God remains faithful. This shows us God will never break his promises, even when we fail to keep our end of the bargain. And that leads us to our text, because ultimately that's what this is all about. Now, before we go there, you might remember I call this message Weirdly Beautiful. But I want to make something clear. That title has nothing to do with the beauty of Sarah, and everything to do with the story we're about to cover. The story we're moving into gets pretty weird, but stick around, because it's also immensely beautiful. See, it's one thing to trust in the promises of God, and Abraham shows us how tough that can be, even for the most faithful. But it's another thing to trust in God when he makes you wait. Are you good at waiting? Because I am not. But now imagine you're well past the age when something should happen, but God promises it to you. You take him at his word and believe it, even though it seems impossible to you, and then he makes you wait 10 more years. And by the way, it was a total of 25 years to wait, but at this point in our text, we're only at 10. Abraham was already old to have children when God made the promise in Genesis 12. And Sarah's childbearing years in the natural were long behind her. But by the time we get to chapter 15, 10 years have passed. And it looks like Abraham's faith was fading. Go to Genesis 15:1. Now we're only getting 2 words in to start off with. After this, stop there. Okay, this chapter starts with after this. And that might want to make you ask the question, after what? Well, first of all, we have the split between Abraham and Lot that we already talked about. The land couldn't support their animals anymore, so they'd have to go their separate ways. Abraham gave Lot a choice of land, and they separated. When Lot left, God made Abraham the promise of the land they were living on for his descendants. Lot picked the part of the land that had 2 cities on it. It looked like a great deal in some ways, but it was the worst real estate decision ever, because the 2 cities that this land had on it were Sodom and Gomorrah. But that comes a little later in our text. Almost immediately, though, the area that Lot chose came under attack, and Lot was taken captive. So Abraham raised up a small army of trained men and rescued Lot. After which Abraham met the mysterious Melchizedek, and who blessed him. And that's where we find ourselves when God made contact with Abraham once again. Genesis 15:1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Again, all these battles and bloodshed may have been enough to shake Abram. It might have also been the weight. But God wanted to remind Abraham that he was still with him. All those who are in Christ have the same promise. God has promised never to leave nor forsake us. He is with us. He is our strength. He is our shield. And those words of encouragement should have built Abram up. But Abraham was struggling. He believed God when God made that amazing promise. But 10 years have passed since that, and now Abraham was looking at plan B. This won't be the last time Abraham does this either. Verse 2 of Genesis 15 says, "But Abram said, 'Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?' And Abram said, 'You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir.'" Remember, God promised Abraham an heir. 10 years have passed, there's still no heir. And Abraham is starting to have questions for God. Abraham's getting older, God hasn't come through, so not knowing how much of his time he has left, Abraham decided to make one of his servants his heir. It kind of makes sense, except for one thing. When God has a plan, there's no need for plan B. When God makes us wait, we need to trust that his timing is perfect. Is that always easy? No, but it is always right. God delivers on his promises every time. How many times have we gotten ahead of God's plan and tried to do things our way instead? We may never know, but this much we can know. God knows everything, and he will make a way, and we can trust him by faith. God promised an heir, and there will be one. Look at verse 4. "Then the word of the Lord came to him, 'This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir.'" It strikes me that God is being very patient here with Abraham, right? It's almost as if God is sympathizing with Abraham about the wait. But then God reaffirms the promise in verse 5. He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky, count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be. Your offspring will outnumber the stars in the sky." Now, of course, that's figurative language. It's an illustration, not an exact number. But who are the children of Abraham? And of course, your first answer, and it is correct, is the Jewish people. But consider this. Jesus came through the Jewish people. And all who come to him by faith receive the right to become children of God. So it's safe to say Christians are included in that as well. So in a very real sense, all the Jewish people and all the Christians for all time could be numbered as the children of Abraham. That's a lot of people. God kept that promise, and look what happened. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. There it is. But Abraham had another question, verse 7. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. The land Abraham was standing on was the promised land. It was the land that God would give to Abraham's descendants in about 500 years. So it was kind of his, but not yet. But Abraham said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? In case you were waiting, this is the weirdly beautiful part. So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, that's a cow, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. So this was some kind of offering, right? Well, sort of. And to be honest, this was the part I didn't understand. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. In other words, right there where he is, he kills these animals and he cuts them in half. Except for the birds, it appears they probably just got their necks broken. Can you imagine how that scene would have looked? It would have been gory. It would have been grisly. And you can probably imagine that. After he cut the animals in half, he arranged them opposite each other, sort of creating something of an aisle between them. Remember, the Bible tells us that the life of the animal is in its blood. And now it looks like that blood has been spilled everywhere on this aisle. In this covenant ritual, which is what this is, the lesser person in the covenant, walks down the aisle. And what it means is, if I break this covenant, may I end up broken and bloody like these animals. Now, I know that sounds weird, especially to our modern sensibilities. What is even more strange is that Abraham didn't walk the aisle right away as we might expect. So what happened? Genesis 15:11. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. This is a very natural thing, right? Vultures and hawks would eat this stuff. But the ritual was incomplete. So Abraham had no choice but to wait on the Lord and chase the scavenging birds away. This went on until sunset. Then look at verse 12. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there." Look, this is exactly what happened to Abraham's descendants. Exactly. The Jewish people in their future in Egypt, they'll be there for 400 years, and they'll be enslaved and mistreated along the way. God foretold it. It happened just like he said. God's telling Abraham, in essence, I have promised this land and I will deliver it. But it goes on. And I'm seeing a connection here. And it may be a stretch, but I don't think so. The Israelites ended up in Egypt because of a famine at the time of Joseph. Do you remember why Abraham and Sarah ended up in Egypt? Same thing, because of a famine. The Pharaoh at Abraham's time took Sarah as his own. The Pharaoh at Moses' time took Israel to be his own. Do you remember what happened to Pharaoh when he took Sarah from Abraham? Plagues came against Pharaoh until he released Abraham's bride. And Abraham left Egypt with more than he came with. And in Abraham's future, his descendants found themselves back in Egypt. God's people, who God would later call the bride of Christ. And another Pharaoh took God's people, his bride, if you will. And because Pharaoh took them and enslaved them, he and all the people of Egypt faced devastating plagues. And now look at Genesis 15:14. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. Doesn't that sound like what happened in Genesis 12 was somehow prophetic for what would happen in Exodus? Of course, there's also some good news. God says to Abraham, verse 15, "You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." In other words, God is saying, I will take care of you, Abraham, and I will keep this promise to give your descendants this land when the time is right. God was taking this land from the Amorites to give it to the Jewish people. But God is ultimately just. He would only take the land from the Amorites when they had done all God knew they would do against him to deserve his punishment. Remember, God is all-knowing. He knows everything that's coming. And he is ultimately just, and he is ultimately faithful. Because you see, there's more. Abraham is there, near this Isle of Blood that he has set up. And God has just finished saying this stuff and laying out the terms of the covenant. It was now time to walk the aisle. It was time to seal the covenant. Except for one thing. Abraham, representing humanity, never walked the aisle. Look at verse 17. This is the beautiful part. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. The firepot and the torch passed through instead of Abraham. Those are symbolic of God. Fire represents his holiness and judgment. The fire would also be used to offer animals like those that were used to make up this aisle. Now look, this aisle of blood is kind of weird. It represents a covenant between God and man. Now in this case, it was for the promised land. And we'll see that in the next few verses, Genesis 15:18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Cherizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So yes, this covenant was about the promised land, but it seems to be representing something more. The covenant between God and man itself. And God didn't break the covenant, man did. And man should have been the one to walk the aisle, saying, if I break this, what happened to these animals is what should happen to me. But instead, God walked the aisle. And God determined to pay the price, that he would be broken and bloodied and even die. He is perfectly just, so the price had to be paid. But he is also perfectly loving, so he would be the one to pay it. He would be the one to walk the aisle. He would be the one to be broken for our sins. So yes, this symbolic act might seem weird, but it's also very beautiful. It shows our promise-keeping God being totally faithful and totally dependable. And he walked the line for you and me. And because of his perfect faithfulness, you and I can have faith. Trust him. Amen.